Well, I don't want you to get lost in this, Clyde, and neither would I have you to be confused. So let me just walk through this thing with you real slowly and make sure that you kind of envision how all of this is put together. It isn't that complicated. All we are talking about is neurons. Neurons are cells that maintain a polarized membrane. A polarized membrane is what I would describe as a trigger waiting to be pulled because nature hates a separation of charges. So these neurons exist in clusters. In the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord only, those clusters of neurons are called nuclei. In the peripheral nervous system, which is everything besides the brain and spinal cord, we would call those clusters of neurons ganglia. So we divide the nervous system up into the central nervous system, which is brain and spinal cord only. That does not include the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. That does not include the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. It only includes the brain and the spinal cord and the neurons that are bundled together in those tissues with their associated glial cells. So that is the central nervous system, and we have already gone through all of that. In the peripheral nervous system, well, we have motor fibers and we have sensory fibers. So we talked about the ascending and the descending pathways and the signals that pass through the thalamus, the sensory signals, which are perceived in the somaesthetic cortex. We talked about the motor signals that originate in the motor cortex of the frontal lobe. They descend by way of the internal capsule. They cross over at the medulla oblongata, and they are the descending pathways, the corticospinal pathways of the spinal cord. In the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, we will divide those up into what is somatic and what is autonomic. If it is somatic, then that means it's voluntary. So those are the signals to contract skeletal muscle voluntarily. Well, we have talked about that in great detail. What we want to talk about today is the autonomic nervous system. So these are motor signals that originate in the central nervous system and then exert their effect autonomically, apart from the consciousness, apart from the power of one's will. So we divide the autonomic nervous system up into two divisions, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. When we say sympathetic, we are basically saying having the effect of epinephrine. Well, you know the effect of epinephrine, you've experienced it. Anything that has the effect of epinephrine is going to increase the blood pressure, it's going to dilate the pupils, it's going to increase the heart rate because you are geared up for action. You got to run for your life from that armadillo with rabies. Man, you got to pump some blood, you got to bring in some air, you got to fight and run. So that is the effect of the hormone epinephrine. So consequently, we use the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, which has the same effect as the hormone epinephrine, except it's a neurotransmitter. So the sympathetic division will release norepinephrine at the target tissue, and the effect is the fight or flight response. On the other side, we have the parasympathetic division, which is the other side of a seesaw. So we are neither sympathetic or parasympathetic. We are simply a balance between the two. We have to rest. We have to have times when we relax and when we simply veg out because the digestion of food, the secretion of hormones, the removal of metabolic waste from the blood, all of those things are parasympathetic functions. You got to be relaxed, you got to be laid back, you got to let your blood pressure go down, you got to let your heart rate go down, you need to let your pupils constrict. So the parasympathetic nervous system is about that time of slowdown, getting sleepy, drowsy, dozing off to sleep, because there are many physiologic processes that only work when you key it down. If you are always keyed up, then you're going to have problems. Now, you can go too far the other way. Also, a person can be keyed down too much. So we have to maintain a balance of sympathetic division and parasympathetic division stimuli. So this is all we're talking about here is the autonomic nervous system. I made mention of this when I was talking about the hypothalamus, and I compared the hypothalamus to being a store manager. Well, the autonomic nervous system is managed by the hypothalamus. That does not mean that it is not subject to influence from higher brain areas. It is the manager, but it is influenced by other limbic system structures, and it can be very well influenced by the areas of the brain where the lights are on. We do have some conscious control over autonomic functions. And then again, there are some autonomic functions which we don't seem to have much control over at all. So the hypothalamus is regarded as the manager of the autonomic nervous system, but the manager can certainly be influenced by the owner. Okay, check out the next slide and it will detail some of these things that I've just mentioned. In the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, this is also called the craniosacral division, because the nuclei of these nerve fibers are located either in the brain or in the sacral area of the spinal cord. So the craniosacral or parasympathetic nervous system, let's go through these. We have 4 of the cranial nerves that contain parasympathetic fibers. Parasympathetic fibers will release acetylcholine at the target tissue, and we'll go through the responses to the acetylcholine as we go. The 4 cranial nerves that have parasympathetic fibers are cranial nerve number 3, that is the oculomotor nerve. Consequently, innervation of the iris of the eye will result in constriction of the pupils by way of the oculomotor nerve. So it is the parasympathetic innervation of the iris that results in the constriction of the pupils. Production of saliva, that is controlled by parasympathetic fibers present in cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve, and also cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. So when we talk about rest, relax, digest, well, saliva production is part of digestion. If you want your mouth to go completely dry, so dry that you can't even speak or swallow, well, then just get sympathetically keyed up and see what happens to your saliva production. So the increase in saliva production prompted by parasympathetic stimuli, the release of acetylcholine at the salivary glands. So for cranial nerve number 7, one of the branches goes to the submandibular salivary glands, The other one goes to the lacrimal glands in the upper eyelid. So that is not mentioned here, but the facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7, sends a branch to the lacrimal glands and also a branch to the salivary glands. In the case of cranial nerve number 9, the branch goes to the parotid gland, the large salivary gland that sits just southeast of the ears. Okay, so we've got cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor, innervating the structures of the eyes. We've got cranial nerve number 7 and cranial nerve number 9, that's facial and glossopharyngeal, innervating the salivary glands and also the lacrimal glands. Then we come to cranial nerve number 10. Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve. The nucleus there is in the medulla oblongata. The vagus nerve contains 90% of the parasympathetic fibers in the body. So the terminal neuron or the postganglionic neuron in the vagus nerve will release acetylcholine on the target tissue. In the chest, we form what's called the cardiac plexus and the pulmonary plexus. Those are branches of the vagus nerve that will innervate the heart and the bronchi. So by way of the vagus nerve, cardiac plexus, pulmonary plexus, the release of acetylcholine by the parasympathetic fibers of the vagus nerve decreases the heart rate. At the same time, it will dilate the blood vessels and constrict the bronchi. So we are resting and relaxing. There's no reason for our blood pressure to be high. That's why we dilate the blood vessels to bring the blood pressure down. There's no reason for the heart rate to be high. We're relaxing. There's no reason for the bronchi to be dilated. We don't need to breathe that much air while we're just kicking back and relaxing. So by way of the cardiac plexus and the pulmonary plexus, branches of the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, then we have those target tissues and the parasympathetic response of those tissues to the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Notice here we decrease blood flow to the skeletal muscles. Well, there's no reason to run blood to the skeletal muscles if all you're doing is kicking back, watching Andy Griffith reruns. So that is, again, branches of the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. Increasing stomach and intestinal motility. Well, this is that aspect of life that we have to attend to, and it only takes place when we are resting and relaxing. Maybe you have heard that it's not a good idea to go to a picnic and eat a whole lot and then go and try to swim across the lake. Well, you see the inconsistency there. If you eat, then you need to digest. If all of your blood goes to your skeletal muscles, then how are you going to digest what you just ate? You can't, and so your stomach will cramp. And so this is why your parents probably told you, don't go swimming on a full stomach. Because if you have a full stomach, you need for your blood to go to the stomach and intestines for the purpose of digesting. If you try to swim across the lake, then the blood tries to go to your skeletal muscles. Your stomach is going to cramp. If your stomach cramps, you might very well sink. Okay, so moving on down to the sacral branches here. These are called the pelvic splanchnic nerves, offering parasympathetic innervation to the structures of the perineum, such as the genitalia, the uterus, the rectum, the uh, the internal anal sphincter. Okay, well, you figure that. On the other side, the sympathetic division. Well, just the opposite. We're going to release norepinephrine at the target tissue. So what we're going to get here is dilation of the pupils, decreased saliva production. Saliva is part of digesting. We're not interested in digesting if we're running from an armadillo with rabies. We need an increased heart rate. We need increased blood pressure. We need to dilate the bronchi to bring in more air so that we can run faster and farther. So these are the sympathetic responses, the responses to the neurotransmitter norepinephrine released by the postsynaptic neuron of the sympathetic division. Now notice that the sympathetic division is entirely thoracic. So we call parasympathetic craniosacral. That's where the nuclei are located. In the sympathetic division, all of the nuclei are located between T1 and T12. That means they are thoracic in their origin. Okay, so that's a little bit of a summary of the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We'll get a little more detailed on the next few slides. In the autonomic nervous system, what we have are two neuron pathways. One is called the preganglionic neuron. The other is called the postganglionic neuron. The preganglionics are shown in this illustration in black. The postganglionic neurons are shown in red, and the ganglia, where they synapse with each other, is shown as a green ball. In the parasympathetic division, usually the preganglionic neuron is very long. The postganglionic neuron is very short. As a matter of fact, the preganglionic neuron normally runs almost all the way to the target tissue before it will synapse with the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so let's go through these. Should be a review of what I just talked about. Find the nucleus of cranial nerve number 3. That is the oculomotor nerve. Its nucleus is located in the midbrain. So our preganglionic neuron, shown in black, runs to the green ball. That green ball there for cranial nerve number 3 is called the ciliary ganglion. The ciliary ganglion actually sits right behind the eyeball. So the preganglionic neuron is very long. The postganglionic neuron is very short because the ganglion is right behind the eyeball, and we're only innervating the lens and the iris of the eye. So that is our oculomotor nerve offering parasympathetic stimulation to the lens and the iris of the eye. The next cranial nerve carrying parasympathetic fibers, well, that is cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve. The nucleus is located in the pons. Find it. Notice that the facial nerve will send out 2 parasympathetic branches. So the one going up north there, follow the branch off of cranial nerve number 7 going up north. That ganglion is called the sphenopalatine ganglion. So the preganglionic neuron synapses with the postganglionic neuron at the sphenopalatine ganglion, and then the postsynaptic neuron will innervate the lacrimal gland and also the nasal glands. Okay, go back to the preganglionic neuron for cranial nerve number 7. Let's go with the lower branch. So the lower branch there is going to synapse at a ganglion that is called the submandibular ganglion. The postganglionic neuron will then go to the submandibular salivary gland to increase the flow of saliva. So for cranial nerve number 7, we have a split. We have 2 different branches there that we follow. One goes to the sphenopalatine ganglion, the other goes to the submandibular ganglion. All right, find the next cranial nerve there. That is cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal. The ganglion where the synapse takes place is called the otic, O-T-I-C, ganglion. Otic means ear. So the parotid glands sit just below the ears. So follow the postganglionic neuron to the parotid gland to increase salivation. Salivation is part of digesting. All right, our next cranial nerve there coming out of the medulla oblongata, that is cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. This is a very long nerve. It is called vagus because vagus means wanderer. So it's going to innervate things in the head, it's going to innervate things in the neck, in the chest, and the abdomen, all the way down to the floor of the pelvis. So the vagus nerve is very long. As I said, 90% of the parasympathetic fibers in the body are in the vagus nerves. Okay, so for nerve number 10, vagus, coming out of the medulla oblongata, giving us a cardiac and a pulmonary plexus. There is also an esophageal plexus. There is also an abdominal aortic plexus that arises from the vagus nerves. So notice how long the preganglionic neurons are and how short the postganglionic neurons are. Preganglionic is shown in black, postganglionic is shown in red. So the long nature of the preganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic division is shown here. Okay, as we go down into the abdominal viscera, stimulation of peristalsis and secretion of digestive enzymes and all of the stuff that goes with digesting food, well, that is dependent upon vagus nerve innervation. The target tissue is going to receive acetylcholine from that postganglionic neuron, and so the effect of acetylcholine there to stimulate the digestive processes. The same is true with the liver. The liver makes bile. Bile is necessary for digesting fats. So we once again have to have a rest and relax phase to our life in order to properly digest food and absorb nutrients. The next branch that is shown there coming off the vagal trunks, that's the kidneys. Well, the kidneys remove metabolic waste from the blood. That's something that you need to rest and relax to do. So it is a parasympathetic dynamic. Notice also that by way of the pelvic splanchnic nerves, those are the sacral part of the parasympathetic nervous system, we innervate the bladder. Notice that parasympathetic stimulation of the bladder prompts it to contract. Well, that is the effect of acetylcholine on the bladder. If a person is not relaxed, they might very well not be able to urinate, right? A person, how you've probably heard of people who are pee shy. They're concerned about somebody watching them, and so they get a little uptight and they're not able to urinate. Yeah, well, you can see the dynamic there. You have to relax and not be uptight in order to pee, and urinate. Okay, so the other structures of the pelvic floor also innervated by branches of the pelvic splanchnic nerves carrying parasympathetic fibers, consequently acetylcholine. Uh, you figure it out. These are the branches that are going to innervate the genitalia. If anything good is going to happen between the boy and the girl, there has to be some well, you got to be relaxed there, or things are not going to work the way that they're supposed to. You figured that for yourself. Well, here we are with the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Notice that our nuclei are located in the spinal cord between T1 and T12. So this is called the thoracolumbar division. parasympathetic was called craniosacral. Well, this is thoracolumbar. So the nuclei are located in the spinal cord. The preganglionic neurons are shown in black. Notice that they're very short. That's because the ganglia, where the synapse takes place, is situated just left and right of the vertebral column. So the preganglionic neuron is very short. To get to the target tissues is going to require a very long postganglionic neuron. Notice that if we're going to innervate structures in the head, well, then those fibers are going to have to head north from where they originate down in the thoracic area of the spinal cord. Well, if we constricted pupils by way of the parasympathetic fibers, well, then in the case of sympathetic stimulation, the pupils will dilate. Well, remember that we prompted salivation in the parasympathetic division. Well, in the sympathetic division, that will inhibit salivation. The mouth will go painfully dry if you are very nervous. I see this happen every spring. I give students a term paper and they have to stand in front of their classmates and report on the findings of their research. Well, that makes them nervous, and when they're nervous, their mouth will go dry and they have a difficult time speaking. I laugh about it, but that's only because it's them and not me standing up there trying to report. Okay, so the other tissues here innervated by sympathetic fibers, uh, enjoying the effects of the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. Notice that we're going to relax or dilate the bronchi. That's because we need to take more air in. Notice that we're going to accelerate the heartbeat. That's because we need to pump more blood, more oxygen, more glucose to the brain and to the skeletal muscles. Well, what if we are sympathetically innervating the guts? Well, it's going to have just the opposite effect of the parasympathetic stimulation. So we inhibit digestive activities, we inhibit urinary activities, etc., etc. So you know the effects of both parasympathetic and sympathetic. There is a little bit of anatomical detail that we need to go into when we talk about the sympathetic division, and that will come up on the next couple of slides. Okay, so here is the nucleus of a sympathetic fiber located in the gray matter of the spinal cord. These are motor fibers. So motor fibers exit the spinal cord through the front door. So follow the gray line there exiting through the ventral root. That's the front door. Motor fibers exit through the front door. Sensory fibers enter through the back door. Well, look up there and see the back door. That is the dorsal root with its dorsal root ganglion. Well, we're talking about motor fibers here of the autonomic nervous system. So originating in the nucleus, which is located between T1 and T12 of the vertebral column. So the fibers are exiting through the front door. Okay, follow the red line. That is the sympathetic fiber coming out. Notice that the dorsal root and the ventral root come together. When they come together, that forms the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve only runs for about an inch, and then it bifurcates into a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. Okay, we did that previously when we talked about spinal nerves. Let's follow specifically the sympathetic fiber here. So the red line is the sympathetic fiber. So notice that it comes by way of the ventral root to the spinal nerve. Once it travels a short distance in the spinal nerve, it then makes a detour. That detour is called the white ramus communicantes. It is white because it's myelinated. This is our preganglionic neuron. The ganglia are located just right and left of the vertebral column. So the preganglionic neuron is very short. It only goes from the spinal cord to just outside the vertebral column. That's where the sympathetic trunk ganglia are located. So the presynaptic sympathetic fiber travels by way of the white ramus communicans down to the sympathetic ganglion. That's where it synapses with the postganglionic neuron, which is going to go all the way to the target tissue. So that postganglionic neuron is not myelinated, so it is called the gray ramus communicantes. Okay, so just follow it from where it starts to where it goes. So in the sympathetic division, we're going to exit through the front door. We're going to join in with the spinal nerve, make a short little detour out to the sympathetic ganglion. That's where the presynaptic neuron synapses with the postganglionic neuron, and the postganglionic neuron will go all the way to the target tissue. So in the sympathetic division, the preganglionic fiber is very short. The postganglionic fiber is usually very long. Now there are three different directions that the postganglionic neuron might go. So I will detail those on the next couple of slides. All right, just stay with me here and I will bring this to a place where it makes sense to you. So we are in the lateral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord between vertebral levels T1 to T12. This is where the nuclei of these sympathetic fibers are located. Since they are motor fibers, they're going to exit the spinal cord through the front door, which we call the ventral root. Notice that the ventral root comes together with the dorsal root to form the spinal nerve. So our preganglionic sympathetic fiber is running in the spinal nerve. It makes a short detour down to the sympathetic ganglion at that vertebral level. We call that little branch the white ramus communicans. It is simply the preganglionic fiber. The preganglionic fibers are myelinated, so they are called white. Now, one possibility here, the synapse with the postganglionic neuron takes place at that vertebral level, in that ganglion, which is at the same level as the nucleus. So that would be shown as possibility number one there. Notice that the synapse takes place in that ganglion, and the postganglionic neuron goes from there to the target tissue. So that is called the spinal nerve route. When the white ramus synapses with the postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic ganglion at that vertebral level, it is called the spinal nerve route. Possibility number two. So let's follow the green lines. Notice that we have a green line that goes to the sympathetic ganglion, but it doesn't synapse there. One of them heads due north, the other one heads due south. So it doesn't synapse at the ganglion, which is at its level. So when our preganglionic neuron does that, it doesn't synapse at its level. It goes either up the sympathetic trunk or down the sympathetic trunk before it synapses with the postganglionic neuron. That is shown as possibility number two. We call that the sympathetic route. So for number one, that is called the spinal nerve route. For number two, that is called the sympathetic route. We then have a third possibility. So go from the white ramus communicans. Notice that we have some fibers that don't synapse at that level, at that ganglion right there at its own vertebral level. It passes through and goes out to what is called a collateral ganglion. When the synapse doesn't take place with the postganglionic neuron until it reaches a collateral ganglion, those are located in the abdominal cavity, then we call that a splanchnic nerve route. So we have three possibilities. The sympathetic fibers can follow the spinal nerve route. That means the synapse took place at the vertebral level that is equal to the nucleus. Or we can have the sympathetic route where the synapse takes place at a higher or lower ganglion in the sympathetic trunk. Or we can have the splanchnic nerve route where the synapse with the postganglionic neuron takes place in a collateral ganglion located in the abdominal cavity. Well, I thought I could make that easy for you, but I'm not so sure that I did. Well, so far we've identified the vagus nerve as being the distributor of parasympathetic stimuli to the gastrointestinal structures. It turns out to be certainly a big player, but not the only player, and maybe not even the biggest player in innervating the guts and the abdominal viscera and the entire gastrointestinal system. So we have what is called an enteric nervous system, which can operate independently of the vagus nerve coming from the medulla oblongata. So it is a very richly supplied area of the body with parasympathetic fibers and more than 1 billion neurons present in the enteric nervous system. I think probably the most dramatic illustration of the importance of the enteric nervous system occurs when it fails. There is a condition called Hirschsprung disease, also called megacolon. Megacolon is very common in Down syndrome patients and people who have had Chagas disease. So in the event that the enteric nervous system is damaged or becomes non-functional due to disease, then the musculature that drives peristalsis and segmentation and consequently the elimination of waste, well, those things stop. So if that stops, then the colon simply dilates larger and larger and larger, consequently the name megacolon. Well, if it becomes so full that it ruptures, then all of those bacteria that normally live in the large intestine will be spilled out into the abdominal cavity. That condition is called peritonitis, and peritonitis is one of the most difficult infections to bring under control that we have, and oftentimes will be fatal. So anyway, the enteric nervous system is something that you should be at least superficially knowledgeable about. I would expect any UCA student to be able to answer questions about the enteric nervous system.